The first one I'd like to address is the one that raised the question of learning communities, and the questioner brought up womanist thought and the question of communicating those ideas to white males. One of the things that make the task at hand difficult is that there is something very unhealthy about the way we formulate the challenges at hand. And what I mean by that is there's so much of an obsession of trying to communicate things to white people that it constantly affirms the idea that white people are the central subjects or objects, if we will, of education. We need to move out of that model and just say we, the all-inclusive we of communities. And the reason I say this is because this is where we get into traps of questions, not only of white fragility, etc., but it also doesn't make us address a fundamental problem that's at the heart of racism itself. And what that problem is this. If we step back for a second, try to imagine if you had a child, and from the moment the child is born, you raise that child with the belief that she or he is superior to every other person. And you continue that throughout his or her life. What you would raise is an obnoxious, malignant narcissist. One of the problems is that what we fail to realize is we know the damage that white supremacy imposes, or rather the damage it does to people of color. It's very straightforward. It harms us. It takes the form of degrading us, to tell us we're not really people. The list is long. But what we don't pay attention to is there's also, if you use that child analogy, there's a harm done to the child. Because what you have eradicated from that child is the ability to cope with reality. Because you see, there's no such thing as a child that's born intrinsically superior to anybody. The only thing that would make a child even grow at all is a community that protects, nurtures, and continues to develop that child's ability to deal with the world. So one of the problems we have to deal with is malignant narcissism. If you go and look at the CDC, but not only there, the Mayo Clinic, many other lists, if you look at all the symptoms of malignant narcissism, all you have to do is then think about all of the problems we see with the structural category we call white people. Not white individuals, not Mary, John, or Joe, but the category white people. It maps onto malignant narcissism. The presumption that they're superior to everybody else, the presumption that whatever institution you build, it has to be in their interests, the presumption that they have a right to everything, the presumption that in any way, if they're deprived of whatever they want, it's a harm to them or a form of victimization, and the list goes on and on and on. So I think we need to get rid of that. White people need to grow up. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of us, when we indulge these fantasies, we contribute to the problem as well. What we need to do is to build alternative systems of knowledge, create the infrastructure for them, and start things working in such a way that the reason those white people would need to work with the new institutions with us is because they work. In other words, if white people are at all interested in truth or reality, and not all are, as we know. Right now, the problem is that we're being governed by individuals who are actually committed to the production of misinformation, disinformation, in short, falsehood. But they're not everybody. And the fact of the matter is you got to start with those with whom you can work and together build alternatives. So if we build those that are premised upon not only institutions of learning that are connected to reality, but we also begin to deal with the proper place of knowledge, which requires a form of what's called epistemic humility. And epistemic humility is when you understand you don't know everything, but it's important to learn something. And within that framework, one of the things that we would do in communities of learning, you notice I said communities. I didn't just simply talk about methodologies or individuals. Communities of learning are communities in which people learn with and from each other. And this is one of the things that, and it's very disquieting for some white people, because some white people are so entrenched with the idea that there's nothing for them to learn from people of color, that the very idea of a person of color in front of them in the classroom for them is disconcerting. But that is mirrored also by colonial institutions of learning, because we know the messages we get from that. One message is that there's nothing to learn from anybody but white people. The other message we get from it is the idea that given there's nothing to learn from anybody but white people, then all reality just depends on studying basically the world from the perspective of white people. But that is not only a form of decadence, it's also a form of racism. And in addition to that, it's a form of epistemic racism and colonization. And what it does is it locks not only white people, but the other people who are not white who adhere to that in a silo. So I think the thing that what we have to deal with are basically, the thing is for us to develop several directives. The first directive is we need to set up an understanding of proper communication, not through centering white people, but through communicating with everybody around us what we need to do to build and extend our understanding of things beyond ourselves. Second, we need to develop practices of listening. And that means that we need to understand that speech or communication is about speaking at people, but speaking with, learning with, and listening. And in other words, we have to, by way of example, set the conditions. But as we know, conditions are not completely in our control. The conditions that we have to set up are conditions that enable a form of growth, a form of fostering, a form of fertile environment, so to speak, for other things to grow. So to conclude that, my remarks in that question, we need to abandon the model in which we say, something needs to be done about X. And then we turn and we look for somebody else to do it. Recognizing a problem is a call to do something about it. And I would recommend at this point that we need to think beyond these models of simply dealing with what white people need to know. Because the truth is, a lot of white people do know these things. There are those who are not willing to face it because they find the truth very traumatic. But some of the ideas I was mentioning when I spoke earlier were ideas that were developed by also white people. There have been white people, for instance, like Douglas Massey in the 19th century, who read African literature and African ideas and built on them. Paulo Freire, in the context of Brazil, in the United States, we don't look at him as a white person, but in Brazil, he's very much a white person. So there's no shortage of white people who actually get this. The problem is that a lot of the institutions of power, those are in white people who are fighting tenaciously against opening up the possibilities of a more just and healthy future.